A really complicated subject. And a lot of people out there, they want to make it complicated. They want to have it be something confusing that you need help with, and you don't. You have resources here at Chaminade to guide you and your student through the testing process, so that's what today is all about, to give you really an insider knowledge to all of these different tests, because there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of intricate details involved with testing. So, starting off, why scores matter, okay? So colleges use scores in their decision process, and most of them do, and it is still pretty important. Now, we always tell students it's not as important as your grades, and that's an important part. Your grades are still your most important component, but we have to be honest, test scores are sometimes the second most important criteria that colleges are looking at. So that's why if colleges are valuing this, we at Chaminade have to value it as well to prepare students for college. Most colleges, they publish student test score information. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing that we have data from those schools. We know what test scores to expect for certain colleges. But it also means that colleges might be hyper-vigilant about their test scores of their admitted freshman class. Okay? So there's two sides to that. Scores also let colleges find students. One of the easiest ways for colleges to find a student that might fit their academic profile is with the PSAT that they take here at Chaminade. Those scores, if the student lets it, will get sent out to the wide world, and colleges can actually find students that way, which is pretty neat. Colleges also use scores for scholarships when they're trying to attract high academic students. They definitely want them to have those scores to match up with their GPA and all the other pieces for that scholarship. And then colleges consider scores in different ways. Okay? Some schools require all the scores, some look at the highest ones, some accept scores from a specific section, or will move them around. We'll go into a little bit more detail and explain what super scoring is, but there is no singular rule for scores in schools because they're all going to look at them a little bit differently and put a little bit different emphasis on their test scores. Well, we always want to say, because scores are important, your testing is important, we always want to add up and say, hey, GPA is still the most important thing. GPA specifically at Chaminade, and colleges will recalculate a student's GPA. They're going to do stuff to it. The most common thing that schools do is they will take out the PE classes. Maybe they'll take out religion classes. Maybe in the UCs, they'll take out any class that isn't UCA through G approved. Now, it doesn't mean those schools don't value those classes and value those grades. In many situations, they expect those types of classes. You know, their graduation requirements, they look at students in the context of their school. Okay? So they really do expect those classes, but they might do some stuff to tweak the GPA to basically balance out so many students across so many different schools across the nation. Another thing that colleges often do is they'll remove the weighting system that Chaminade has. Okay? So that means that the GPA that students see in their, on their computers might not be the same GPA that schools are looking at them with. Okay? And so that's why we have lots and lots of different tools to find out how schools look at our students in the context of Chaminade. And they do. They look at them in the context of Chaminade, which is why their schedule is really important. Okay? Because at Chaminade we have an AP cap, and we don't let certain students take APs their sophomore year, we don't let them take it their freshman year. Colleges know that, and so they're not expecting to see students taking those types of classes in those timings. Just like if a student went to another school that didn't have Calc BC, they're not going to punish that student for an opportunity that's not offered to them. So colleges know Chaminade, and they know what we have here, and they know the rigor of our school, which is great because we're a very prestigious school that has a great reputation among colleges. And it's also great because then colleges kind of know that, oh, they can't take 12 AP classes, just impossible. Okay? But they also know the offerings that we have. They know that there are a lot of AP classes here, and we have a high degree of students. So they're going to say, well, why didn't that student that's interested in engineering push themselves into calculus classes, into these advanced math classes that are available to them? So schedule and the types of classes that you're in, balanced with your GPA, is so, so important. And the last thing is we always want students to have sort of an upward trend. Always be sort of pushing themselves, increasing their rigor, and really exploring the things that are important to them. We really encourage students to increase their rigor in areas that they like. They don't have to increase their rigor across the board. Oh, I need to be in AP English because I was in honors English last year. Well, hang on. Why don't you go into normal English and then double up on your AP Sciences? Yeah, that's a good idea. So students can push themselves in the way that balances them. So again, this has nothing to do with testing, but we like to say that this is the most important part of a college, what colleges are really looking at. And so we want that to be at the forefront of what we're telling students, and so we also put it at the forefront of what we're talking to parents about, because sometimes we get testing on the brain and it's all we think about. So now let's talk a lot about testing. All right, so the two main tests that are going to be required for the majority of colleges in the United States is the SAT and the ACT. Let's take a quick snapshot of each of them to try to see a little bit more about those tests. The ACT has an English, a math, a reading, and a science section, and an optional writing section. Read, not optional. They need to take the writing section, always. Okay. The English section, 75 questions, 45 minutes. Math is 60 questions, 60 minutes. Reading, 40 questions, 35 minutes. Science, 40 questions, 35 minutes. Okay. There used to be a really big difference between the SAT and the ACT. There used to be some strategy to figuring out which test fits you better, and there's really a lot of thinking going into which test works for that student. The ACT changed their structure a little bit, the SAT changed their structure a lot, and now there's a ton of overlap. The tests are pretty similar now. And so one thing to look at is this is the ACT website. It's super easy to sign up for stuff. Literally, you can just click on a button that says register for the test. And notice they have links for things like test prep. I'll talk a little bit about test prep later, but there's free test prep on the sites as well, and Chaminade has our own test prep resources that we offer free to students as well. We're going to get into test prep in a lot more detail later. But let's look at the SAT, and we're going to see that there's a lot of similarities for the ACT. Reading, writing, and math. Okay? The big thing that's missing is the science section. No science section in the SAT. Reading, 52 questions, 65 minutes. Writing language, 44 questions, 35 minutes. Math, there's a no calculator and a calculator section, 58 questions, 80 minutes. And an optional, not optional, writing prompt. So we see that the structure of these exams that used to be very different is now pretty similar. I would like to say that the main difference is that science section, which, by the way, is not a traditional science section like a science test. It's more like a reading section on scientific subjects, which the SAT, by the way, has scientific readings in their reading section. So there is still even a little bit of overlap, even with the missing science section. Some people also say that there's some differences with the math section, that the ACT math is harder math, but more straightforward. And some people say that the SAT math is easier math, but trickier problems. Okay. But again, this is not a huge difference between the two. If we look at the SAT's website, we can see that again, there's a big link on the top that just says start practicing. Okay. Planning and preparation for the SAT and the ACT are going to be something that we're going to be talking about. But it's nice to know that there's just a big button right there on their websites that say, hey, start prepping, start practicing, know what your test is about. There's also buttons here that's like register for the SAT, check test centers, print your admission ticket. So really just going to their website, they have buttons just right there on the front page to be doing a lot of the most important things you need for testing. So let's look at the scores, because one of the big differences are the scores, and they're going to be thrown around a lot. Colleges will just quote scores at you like you know what they're talking about. So the SAT has a score from 400 to 1600. Optional essay is scored separately. Okay, so it's a completely different scoring section outside of that 400 to 1600 test. And there's no wrong answer penalty. So students are encouraged to guess strategically and sometimes not, just fill out bubbles toward the end. Similarly, ACT, 1 through 36, optional essay scored separately, not optional essay. no wrong answer penalty. Okay? And these numbers, they don't really mean a lot to us right now, but on every single test, they'll have a percentile score where students can see what percentile they land in. They're like, am I in the 99th percentile? Am I in the 80th percentile? The 50th percentile? Okay. That can give them a good idea of what kinds of colleges they might be looking at. If they're looking at a top 10 school, they should probably be in the top 1% of testing. Things like that. But also, colleges look at us in the context of our schools. So they're looking at Chaminade students compared to other Chaminade students. And so that's why we have really, really good databases on Naviance to be able to show students, hey, these are the test scores that former Chaminade students have had to get into some of these schools. And so there's a lot of feedback that we can get. Here's my score, here's where I need to be, here's where other Chaminade students were. And that's what we want to encourage students to do. This is not one test you sign up for on one day and it's done. Testing is a process. You create a plan. You set your aspirations. You test and you practice and you set everything up. And even when you take the test, you have the opportunity to take it again. You have the opportunity to have backup tests even beyond that. So really this is a long process and not this one test, we're done, everything's great. Okay? And part of that process is finding out how they do on tests and what kind of colleges they're interested in and what numbers they need. One thing is that this PowerPoint will be on the website. And so if you do want an SAT-ACT coordinates table, that's a link that you can click on, or you can just type that into Google. And it'll basically pull up a website that'll say, well, this score on the SAT is this score on the ACT. Okay? They've matched up basically the bell curves and made sure that they're equated. And colleges and counselors alike will kind of use that so that we understand, well, what does this score mean and what does that score mean? Okay, let's talk about a super score, because this is a way that two different test dates can generate a higher score for your student. Not every school super scores, but we really like schools that do because it rewards students for taking the test multiple times, for really trying to improve their score. So, for example, we have something up here. We have John's score. And in May, he scored a 1200. A 550 in math, a 650 in reading, adding up to a 1200. A solid little score. In October, well, John really focused on math. He got a 100-point increase on math. That's a great job, John. Getting up to a 650 in math, a 550 in, oh no, he dropped 100 points in reading. Maybe there's a couple passages that he had no idea what it was talking about. So again, yielded a 1200. At some schools, John would be very disappointed because he just has a 1200. He might actually decide to take it again and try to split the difference and, get a 650 on both. But schools that super score, they'll actually take the 650 from October and the 650 in math from May and combine them together for a 1300. Okay. And that's just some schools, and that's just a little bit of a boost for some students. And so if some students have a little bit of a difficult time getting consistent scores, then maybe super scoring could help them out a lot. Most of the time, super scoring will help them out 10 or 20 points. This is kind of an extreme example where it helps them out 100 points. It is recommended that students send all scores so colleges can see sort of the highest scores and see the test progression. Some schools will require students to send all scores. Other schools will say, no, you can pick and choose. College representatives tell us that the scores are an additive process. That bad score you got at the end of your junior year does not impact your decision. No matter how many times they say that, students will still not send their bad score. But you can rest assured that if your student is panicked that one bad score will ruin their college, no, that's not true. Okay? This is, again, a process, and colleges know it's a process. So one bad score gives them a data point so they can go back and work and get that higher score. So they can get back and work and get that higher score. So, which test should I take? Wow, this is the answer that students hate to hear. You should probably start off by taking both of them. We really think that you should take some sort of diagnostic so that you have exposure with the ACT and the SAT. Maybe even you sign up for an ACT or an SAT. I mean, students really don't like that idea of like, oh, well, take your Saturday and spend 3.5 hours, and take an SAT, and then the next Saturday take an ACT. But that's the kind of thing that they really need to do to understand, well, how they like the test. And honestly, that's what I feel is the driving factor in what tests they should take, is how they like it. They're going to be studying this test a lot. They're going to be working with these types of questions like all the time, hopefully practicing for a couple months before they take the exam. And so if they're dreading the science section, don't take the ACT even if you scored 10 points higher on it. Go for the SAT. Or let's say they actually kind of enjoy the science section or the math section on the ACT. It feels easier for them. Feels easy for them. That's the important part. So encourage your student to go after the test that they kind of resonates with them a little bit better. Very rarely are students going to see huge differences in points between the two because honestly, these tests are structured very similarly. But there is the rare situation that some students scores way higher in one test than the other, and then maybe that's the right decision to go for. Okay. But we really like to encourage students to explore these two different tests and get a good feeling for what they feel they do best on. Okay, so that's the ACT and the SAT. Those are the tests that are required for most schools. Again, you can pick one or the other. You don't have to submit both scores to schools. But now we get into some more optional subject-based tests. Okay. The subject tests are multiple choice exams in one subject area. You can take 3 of them on a given date. Okay? 1 hour per exam. I know, I heard a groan out there. Could you imagine taking 3 different subject tests on a single day? Many students do 2. Okay, but you technically can get 3 in. Really, these are recommended for students in applicable AP classes or have a strong propensity in a certain area. These tests can demonstrate something that isn't somewhere else on a student's application. Let's say your student is super passionate about history, but AP history didn't work in their schedule. Have them take a subject test. Say, I know you're disappointed that AP history didn't work for you, but let's go ahead and take a subject test so you can demonstrate that this is a thing you care about, this is a thing you're exceptional in. Okay? It's recommended for students to demonstrate mastery, recommended for students declaring specific majors, specifically engineering. Many, many engineering programs require subject tests. And it's pretty competitive for these subject tests. So these advanced math subject tests, in order to make sure that they're ready for a rigorous engineering program, is very important. And so students going into engineering really need to get their math and their subject tests kind of lined up so they can perform well in those. Because engineering programs have become very competitive. And so we need to make sure that our students are prepared for the testing that gets them into those competitive programs. Some more thing about subject tests. Here are just a few schools that highly, highly recommend subject tests. There are a few that require, but most of the time, they just strongly recommend. Okay? In college admissions, whenever we read strongly recommend, we tell students it's basically a requirement because the competition level at some of these schools listed up here is insane. Okay? Whenever a student says, hey, this is a recommended optional essay, should I do it? And I'm like, yes, you need to do the strongly recommended essay. It means they also have to do those strongly recommended subject tests. So pay attention, students need to pay attention a little bit to what the requirements of the colleges they're applying to. And if a lot of their competition is taking subject tests and doing really well on it, then that might be a piece of their application that's missing. So that could be pretty important. So check out those kinds of subject tests. Also, this is one of the downsides of Chaminade. We're an amazing school, have a great reputation, and so along with that, colleges kind of expect some subject tests. They're expecting to see a high caliber student that has every level of preparation. Okay? And so they're looking for those kinds of tests in their file. For these top schools, again, 5,000 schools in the United States. There's a lot of different things going on. So in many situations, your student might say, no, actually, I don't need subject tests for these schools, and they could be right. But when we're talking about the most competitive schools, then we need to up our own competition level with some testing. AP exams. Yes, colleges want students to take the test. We want students to take the test. Getting a positive score on the AP exam is really, really great, and the AP test doesn't usually matter in the college admissions process. So if students are worried about taking the test and getting a 2 or a 3, they should not be worried. Okay? They should just take the test. The AP test is supposed to be this positive process that only adds to their file. But students are often afraid. They're like, I don't know, this is really hard. I don't know if I'll do well on the test. Yeah, AP classes are hard. They're college classes. And the AP test is a hard test. But we don't want that to scare students away from taking the exam. And getting a good score on AP tests is so good for the students. If they can go into college with college credit from those AP classes, I mean, that's great for them. That's freedom. That's the ability to minor, maybe, or the ability to take fewer classes. Let's say they have organic chemistry sophomore year, the bane of every pre-med student. If they got a few extra classes under their belt, why don't they take 12 credits that semester? Get a few hours back in a class less so that they can focus on organic chemistry. Why not study abroad and kind of waste a few classes here and there? Why not go to Pepperdine and take surfing, as one of your PEs or something like that? And that's kind of what colleges are for. So these AP classes are great because the classes themselves impress colleges. They love that in their schedule. But the test, well, this just provides them freedom and flexibility when they're in college. And they don't have to be scared of their 2 that they got because they had a horrible testing day to affect their admissions. It doesn't. Okay. The grading class is the critical component, and there's huge advantages that I mentioned some of them, and most schools don't factor them in at all. Make sure that it's a positive and not a punishment to take these kinds of tests. If they do want their strength in these classes to be like graded and evaluated by these college admissions officers, have them take a subject test. Okay? The subject test is the test that admissions officers are looking at and evaluating and using as a data point. The AP exams are, for the most part, not. Okay, now let's get down to the testing recommendations. We have a specific testing plan that we have in place that we really sort of encourage our students to follow. Mostly because it sets them up for a stress-free testing environment. In the fall of 9th grade, they take the PSAT 8-9. Your students, if you're a 9th grader, they've already taken that. And they'll get their scores back in December or January. In the fall of the 10th grade, they'll take the pre-ACT. Okay? Both of those tests, they don't really matter. We don't want to tell the students that all the time, but really they don't. They're just there to get feedback. We want the students to be able to look at their test and be like, oh, I'm pretty good at this, Or they look at their test and they're like, oh, wow, I really don't know Algebra 1 as well as I thought I did. Okay? Being really aware of how they test is something we want students to have, to get that feedback to see not only how they're doing, but also how they do on a wider scale, a broader scale, a national scale. Because so often, Chaminade is in this little bubble where students compare themselves against their peers, and they have pretty smart peers. And so seeing things on a national level can sometimes put things into perspective a little bit. In the fall of the 11th grade, they'll take the PSAT, and that has the National Merit Scholarship Qualifier attached to it. So the PSAT is the first thing that has something of importance. For most students, it's just another practice. They're getting feedback about the SAT and how they do on it. But for some students, and we have students every year at Chaminade, they can get qualified for scholarships, for recognition, because of their scores on the PSAT. So some students are going to take the PSAT very seriously and it matters to them. And other students, again, this is just part of the process, a data point. Because this is the last test that they're going to take before we really want them to get their plan in place, to start taking the real thing. That's why in the spring of their 11th grade, we want them to have a study plan, to know when they're taking the SAT or the ACT, to maybe practice some of the sections to know which test they're taking, or maybe they've decided to take both of them, which is a really good decision. To start lining up subject tests available. By the way, at the spring of the 10th grade, if they're taking like AP World and they want to take a subject test, that might be a good time to do that as well. But when they start taking AP classes, that's usually when we'll have some subject tests going on. So the spring 11th grade, they might want to be taking a few of those subject tests. And we really want them to take their first real test. And again, this is part of the process. Most students will score better their second time that they take the test. Most students will improve their exams over time, and most students, the later they take it, the better they do. Okay? So this is, again, part of the process. Take it in your junior year, and at the end of your junior year in the springtime, maybe get feedback from that, study over the summer, take it again as soon as you come back your senior year. When you come back your senior year, there's a bunch of different opportunities to take the test. We really want students to wrap things up early. We really want to finalize their testing by November. That way, everything's done, everything's great, the student feels great and confident, but just in case something horrible happens, there's still a December test date. Okay? The December test date for the SAT works for all Cal States and UCs, even though their deadline is November 30th. Okay? So part of this process, again, is reducing stress. This is a stressful time for students, and always having that backup, that safety net for testing usually takes away a lot of anxiety. If you know that, like, if everything goes horrible, there's a plan to get out of it. That usually reduces a lot of stress, and so we always want students to have that sort of backup plan. So that's why we encourage them to wrap things up early, so that we have time in case something goes wrong to be able to handle it. One thing you really want to do is beware of testing burnout. I'm going to talk about how to create the plan for testing and for studying, in a little bit. But one thing we always want to keep in mind is reducing stress, reducing the possibility of burnout. Because just imagine if taking these tests stretches on for 2 years of your life. You're always studying. You're always doing everything that you can to sort of prepare for this, and you're never quite getting where you want to be. Oh my gosh, it's so frustrating, and that can lead to some diminishing returns on students' efforts. So let's talk about a plan. Okay, there's a few different ways that we want to sort of structure students and explain to them, hey, you need to have something in place before taking these tests. You need to study, okay, and they really do need to study. Their competition is studying. Okay? Now, we're not talking about this crazy study plan where they've studied for years, but we are talking about preparation, feeling comfortable with the test. Okay? There's a few different ways to study. The first one is self-study. We have tons of options for self-studying. You saw on the websites that both the ACT and the SAT have options for self-study. We have things like Khan Academy, Chaminade Library pays for Shmoop, and we have the access here. And so we're buying test prep services for our students already. Okay? And these services are great. They help you get feedback about where you are, plan out your study schedule. And the key to this kind of stuff is not the resources. The resources are there. You know, even if you buy a book, a classic, buy a book on Amazon, that's like $20. Okay, it's not always about the resources. There's tons of free resources. We have them, but it's about the plan. The students really need to be organized enough to be able to say, I'm going to study. I'm going to do it this day, this day, this day. This is what I'm going to cover. And that organization is something that sometimes students really struggle with. Okay? But different students, again, are different. One of the best advantages of self-study is that, for the most part, it can be free. $20 for a book. Okay? And when we're talking about test prep services, which I will talk about a little bit later, we could be comparing that to thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars. And so we have to compare what's best for your student and what the results are that you get out of each one of these plans. One other way that they're studying, classes. Classes can be great because they provide structure in most situations. If a student has somewhere that they need to go, they have homework that they need to do, sometimes that structure is worth it. There are free classes that exist. There are very, very expensive classes that exist. One of the things that's really difficult when talking about creating plans and test prep is that there's a wide variety of different options available. And so many of them are personalized and customizable, and so many of them just aren't. You know, you have an instructor that's been trained for an hour reading out of the same book you bought on Amazon for $20. Okay? And so that's why I'm trying to inform you about all of these different test preps and all these different plans so that you have the information to go into test prepping and planning with your student and know what questions to ask. Or recognize that, I don't know the answer to this, I'm going to come talk to my counselor to figure out what actually is going on, because we're not selling you anything. That's an important part. So we're going to talk about test prep services in a second. But one thing that's important is how test preparation prepares the student. Test preparation is preparing for that test. One thing that they're distinctly not doing is reteaching geometry. If a student forgot how to calculate triangles, they're not going to stop the class or necessarily go on a tangent to reteach that concept. In many cases, it's up to the student to relearn those basic concepts, and really they're testing strategy and familiarity with these types of questions. So that's one thing that you have to really be aware of. So a lot of these plans and test preparations and the timelines that we're laying out is there to make the student comfortable with the exam, familiarize themselves with these types of questions so they can move smoothly through them, to really expose them to what these tests really mean. They're not designed to go back and teach a student a lot of grammar or reteach how to multiply exponents. That's a tricky one we never use. Another thing that these test preparations really do is when a student sits down in front of a test and they know what's going to be on it and they've done it a bunch of times, they feel so much less stress. And so preparation can oftentimes just bring out the potential of your student. And students are basically going to score within a range of how they practice. But if a student feels comfortable and feels confident and they know what's going on, they know what the test is in front of them, they're going to sit down and they're going to focus on working through the test, and some of that anxiety is just not going to be there. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of long-term study plans. Students can see growth if they study for the test over years. There are diminishing returns. Students usually do the best when they prepare 8 to 10 weeks before the exam. You study for the final. I usually talk to students, I'm like, are you studying for your finals yet? They're like, no. I'm like, yeah, it's too far away. So usually students do best when they prepare for the test 8 to 10 weeks beforehand. And that usually gives them enough time to familiarize themselves with the questions, really get into a rhythm of it, and really feel like they're prepared going into it. There are some study plans out there that say, we're going to start studying in 9th grade, we're going to have a 4-year study plan where you're going to go to classes every week. You might see some growth, but like the amount of effort that goes into that growth it doesn't balance out. Students need more than just tests, and colleges know that. Okay? You can't put down on your activities list, I studied for the SAT a bunch in high school. No, you can't do that. So balance is going to be really key with this kind of stuff. And that's why I want to talk about test prep. I worked, so I've been a tutor for the SAT in the past. I worked for one of these big name test prep companies, and so I went through their training, I taught their classes, and then I went out privately and did my own tutoring for years and years and years and years and years. So I know how the big companies do it, I know how private tutors and stuff like that do it. Okay? So I want to explain to you a little bit of the inside knowledge about test prep companies and how test prep really works so that you have that data going in. You should really ask yourself, what am I paying for? Okay, that's the key. One thing is, if you're paying for diagnostics, it sounds great. We're going to give your student 4 diagnostics, they're going to know exactly where they are, and that could be something worth paying for. But honestly, a diagnostic, that's a test. That's a practice test. Like, you can download those off the internet. I will give you a copy of the SAT. You can have 8 free SAT tests printed out from the internet from the SAT website. Like, that's something that can be done at home with a stopwatch and some paper. Okay? And you can get that score and get some feedback. So diagnostics, it sounds great, but you're not really getting what you pay for there. The next thing, paying for structure. This could be important for your student. Okay? Many students, they tell themselves, I'm going to create a study plan, I'm going to follow it, it's going to be great, and then they do academic triage. They look at their day and they're like, my teacher will yell at me tomorrow if I don't turn in this paper, but the SAT is very far away. I'm going to focus on what I need to focus on, and the SAT constantly gets pushed down. Okay? Structure is something that's definitely worth paying for in some situations, and it's individual. It depends on your student. It depends on your finances. It depends on what you want. One other thing you might want to look at is subject area assistance. Am I hiring a private tutor that will go on that tangent and suddenly spend a lesson teaching about comma splices? Or is this a class that's regimented where my student has to be in the back of their head and say, oh, I need to learn about this, and go off on their own and teach themselves those basic subject area content? So that's something you also want to keep in mind about the flexibility there. Usually a service or a tutor that can kind of go off on a tangent and help your student exactly where they need help, that's a pretty good tutor, and they might cost more money. The other thing that you might be paying for, are you paying for guaranteed improvement? I guarantee an improvement of your score. Yeah, we always can guarantee improvement of score. If students come to class and do the homework, they will improve. None of the places that I worked for or interacted with did this, but some test prep agencies will give a particularly difficult diagnostic. They're not cheating, but they'll give a more difficult than average diagnostic to make sure that, number one, students are a little bit shocked by how low their numbers are, and so they're more likely to feel like they need to buy something, they need your services, and also they can assure improvement on the actual exam because that diagnostic is just a tiny bit harder. Okay? Now I'm not saying that, I'm just saying be aware of that, because it's very easy for companies to say, I guarantee an improvement. Because almost every single student that goes through the process of testing and classes and feedback and does homework will improve. Okay? So it's an easy promise to make, so don't put a lot of emphasis on that promise. Okay. One other thing that we're particularly aware of is upselling, specifically upselling counseling services. Chaminade is full service counseling. Okay, you have access to your counselors right here. And we provide a lot of support for our students. And sometimes when your student's effort for college counseling is split, my outside counselor, my Chaminade counselor, then sometimes things fall through the cracks. Actually, oftentimes things fall through the cracks. We really want our student coming to us when they want to talk about their school, because then we can communicate that through things like their letter or through feedback to the student. The college admissions officers, they want to hear our letter. We talk to them directly. We're friends with them. We have them come onto our campus. And so we want to be great advocates for your students, and that can sometimes not happen as well if your student is having all of their conversations and all of their college talk with someone outside of Chaminade. Okay? So again, it's just a self-reflective process of what am I paying for, what am I getting out of this, and sometimes it might be right for your family, but I just want you to be really aware of what we have going on, and when you're buying something, really kind of know what your purpose is. Because oftentimes, you might be saying, look, I do not want this argument at home. I do not want to structure my students' SAT study time. I get that feedback a lot from parents. And I'm like, that makes sense. You don't want an argument in your home every single day, then maybe you do need to provide some structure for your student for test prep. Or you come back and you say, actually, am I really paying thousands of dollars to avoid reminding my student to practice for the SAT? There's a trade-off there. There's a trade-off there, and it's different for everyone. And so that's why there isn't one hard and fast rule for test prep. It's really dependent upon your family, your student, and really we're here to give you feedback and give you some knowledge about this. Okay, sending your scores. This is an important thing. Students need to send their scores. They have to be sent by the student, because if they're not sent directly from those testing agencies, they're not official. Okay? They basically need to come from the SAT or ACT, usually 2 weeks before they're due. Students kind of, they're a little bit lazy about this. then the College Board has this expedited button. They're like, I want you to fast track my scores to the school through the internet somehow. But they charge you extra money to expedite their scores. So we just remind the students, and we want them to remind them that we do not send your scores, they have to send their scores, and make sure they do it, before their deadlines. And remember, there is no test preference. Again, no test preference. They can send SAT scores or ACT scores. More and more colleges are allowing self-reported scores, which means that students can say what they got, and then if they actually attend that school, then they'll double check to make sure they weren't lying. Okay. Same way they self-report grades for the UCs. Colleges are saying, yeah, that's good. Yeah, we have a question.
Yeah, so since the students take the SAT more than once, some kids do they report each score, or how do they, or like let's say they take it and they're like, oh, I think I want to wait for a better score. Do they wait for the better score? Do they still have to report all of them?
So that's a good question. Some schools will require you to report all of your scores. Okay? Some schools will let you do like score choice, where you pick which scores go to which schools. Usually you pick your high score to go to a school. In terms of timing, it really depends on when their deadlines are. I don't want you to pay, it's $12.50 every time you send a score. I don't want you to pay $12.50 after every single exam to send it to colleges. So many students, they wait until they're done testing. They're like, I'm done, and then they send their scores. There are some students who are flirting with that November 1st deadline, and maybe they took an October test, and they're like, I don't know, maybe I'll send the scores. Then in those situations, they clearly have a unique situation with their testing where they might not be done yet. In that case, they might have to send their scores multiple times to those schools. By the way, sending scores, students are like, I don't know how to do that. So just literally, it's right here on the website. You just click like, hey, learn how to send your SAT scores. Right there, you just click on it. There's a button. That's great. Yeah?
So how long does it take for them to get their scores? Like they take it in March. When will they get their scores?
So one thing that's really funny is that the SAT tries harder to get scores out faster at certain times. So March usually takes a little bit over a month. But for example, those December scores, for some reason, they're out in 3 weeks. Yeah, who knows? So I would say on average a month. Same thing on the ACT. It's like, oh, hey, click on your scores. And basically it's like a little button, and then you just basically send your scores. It's as easy as typing in the names of the schools you're attending and a credit card. Okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to bring on our school therapist to talk a little bit about testing accommodations.
Yeah, and I'm a counselor too. So you can get accommodations. What does that mean? You can get extra time taking the test over multiple days, large print, but there needs to be a diagnosis or a learning disability. To qualify, they like to see it over a long period of time, not just suddenly there's a diagnosis. Do you see what I'm saying? For the SATs and the ACTs, it's a little different. What I'm finding right now, the trend is that it is much harder for us to get accommodations through the ACTs rather than the SATs. I'm not sure why. It could be because of some of the scandals, but they're getting a lot stricter. To apply for it, you can contact me and we can talk through it. But what I've also found is that the ACTs and the SATs are giving 50% extra time. If you want something more than that, if it's not something they already are getting at school, they will not allow that accommodation. All right. So if your student has a diagnosis, a learning disability, please contact me and we can talk about it. What I would like to say is that do it early. Start this process in 11th grade, because it can take 7 to 8 weeks to find out if they accept you. And then if they don't accept, there is an appeal process, but then that takes another 7 to 8 weeks for the appeal process. Some of you might be thinking, great, extra time, my student needs extra time, I'm going to do that. But I want you to think about it. You know your child best. For some students, extra time is more stressful. Okay? They finish their reading portion, and now they have to sit for another half an hour doing nothing. That can sometimes get the wheels going in their head and create more stress. So, like I said, you know your child and what is best for them. And then I can help you in that process, but I get a lot of people calling me at the last minute, and that's very difficult to get an accommodation at the last minute, last semester of their 12th grade year. So really, like I said, get started early, second semester in 11th grade. Give me a call, email me. Email me is probably the best, and I can talk to you about that process. For the SATs, I start the process. Like, let's say I already have paperwork on file at the school. I can start the process. For the ACTs, you have to start the process. You have to register. And then once you register, I go in and submit documentation. So I have to submit all your documentation. And I also have to submit a school plan. All right? So if you have any questions, please email me and I will contact you about it. But I want you to just think about it. It's not always best for the student. Sometimes it creates a lot of stress, having that a whole lot of extra time. Okay?
Thank you. Okay. And then finally, we want to end with maybe this presentation is totally useless and you don't need to know anything about testing. Let's talk a little bit about test-optional schools. Over 1,000 schools in the United States do not require the SAT or the ACT for admission. Okay. Actually, this is pretty common. Everyone in education knows that testing doesn't really accurately measure, the intelligence or the capabilities of your student. The SAT was originally designed as a predictor for how they'll do freshman year. And they've countless times refuted that and said, no, now they don't say that anymore. But it really isn't. Okay? But schools use testing because it's easy. Not using a test is much, much harder. And so that's why you're going to find a lot of private schools that have the resources do this sort of testing optional. And oftentimes they'll require more from students. They oftentimes have a more competitive GPA requirement. They might require more submissions of graded assignments, interviews. They'll look at more of what the student is doing, maybe have them write a different essay. Okay? And in many situations, students might still want to submit their scores to those types of schools. Really, it takes a very special student where there's a huge disparity between their GPA and their test scores before they want to consider not submitting them. Most students have a test score that kind of matches their GPA a little bit. Okay? But when there are schools or students that really testing is not their thing, there are thousands of schools out there that says, yeah, we agree, testing might not be your thing, but we still want you. And that's powerful. Okay, one thing I want to remind you of is on November 21st, we are going to have another College and Coffee. This one will be featuring our guest. She's the director of West Coast Admissions from Marist College, and she's going to talk about everything financial aid. Okay. There's a lot of financial aid myths, kind of like testing myths out there as well, so it'll be really nice to have a professional dispel those myths, kind of guide you through some of the financial aid process. That's November 21st, right here for College and Coffee. We have a few minutes left. Does anyone have any questions about testing? Yeah?
Do colleges tell you up front if they super score?
Yeah, the question is about super scoring. Colleges will say in their policies that we super score. And that's a pretty normal thing that students can ask about. So colleges are used to saying that. Yeah?
Do some schools have preferences for one versus the other, or they really don't care?
The colleges really don't care, SAT versus ACT. A lot of times it's regional. We're on the coasts usually talk in terms of the SAT, so you might be hearing SAT, SAT, SAT because you're in California. In fact, I probably said SAT more times than I said ACT. And if we get a rep from the middle of the country, their language naturally is ACT, ACT, ACT. But there is no real difference and very clearly no preference between them. Yeah?
I have a question. My son's in 11th grade. He came home the other night. He said, Mom, I'm really behind. A lot of my friends are already starting to take the test this fall. And so I noticed that the screen says start taking the test in 11th grade in the springtime. He feels like he's behind already.
So, yeah, so he's not behind. Our plan has our students completing their testing early. So some of those students see our early plan and think, I gotta get ahead of the game. I gotta be even earlier than the early plan. Students that are studying for the SAT right now, they're competing, or they've got all these other seniors that are trying to finish up their testing with them. But more importantly, they haven't gotten feedback from the PSAT yet. So they have one critical data point that they have for free in front of them that they're just saying, no, I don't need that data point. I'll go out of my way and work really hard to create my own data point by taking the SAT. So, can students take the test now in their junior year? Yeah. We still want them to take it in the spring, and we still are probably going to encourage them to take it their senior year. When you start creating a testing plan that has students taking the test 3 or 4 or 5 times, oh my gosh, that's exhausting. Colleges don't look down on that, but they're just like, oh, poor child. So we really want to make sure to reduce that stress and get a plan that's really concise, that you take it the right amount of time. So no, he's not behind. Tell him he's doing a great job. And he'll get his PSAT scores back in December and January and create a plan from that data point. Yeah?
One quick question. So for seniors, when would be like the last, when would be like, okay, this is it?
This is it. This is the final one. Usually the December SAT test date. So it's usually the first week of December, and it's like, nope, that's the cutoff. There are some schools that will accept the January 20-something, late January test scores, but the number of schools that accept that late January test date is much lower. The December test date is the last date, basically. I think there was a question up here.
You answered it.
Awesome. In the back, yeah.
Is it true, I mean, I know the kids don't want to do this, but they can take the test into February and qualify for financial aid?
So there are... Oh, okay. So there are certain opportunities where students might get feedback from the college that says, no, you need to keep taking this test. In some situations, we see it most with athletes, where they're like, they get some feedback from the school, and they're like, no, you need to go back and take that test again. So they go back in January and take it again, or they take it a little bit later, not because of admissions necessarily, but for other factors. So we see athletes kind of going like, I really need to come back in the spring and get a good score on this exam. Financial aid, the process is kind of working, and most schools will launch their financial aid process with their original file. So I would contact the financial aid offices of each school individually to find out whether they, number one, how much of the score they actually use for financial aid, if there's a specific program or a specific scholarship, and then number two, if they'll actually take that score. It's a good question. Yeah?
What are fees for taking the exam?
Yes. What's the current fee for an SAT? 65? 70?
65 with that.
65 with the essay. And by the way, the essay is required. It's required. So $65. And there are test fee waivers. So if you find that your family is struggling financially, then come into the counselor, and there could be some test fee waivers available. Yeah?
Yeah, I know you said numerous times that it does not matter whether you take SAT or ACT, but ACT does have science section. And if your child is a science major or going to science major, does it benefit them if they take ACT?
It might. The only way it would benefit them is if they feel more comfortable in that section. So many students that are going into a science major, they might be like, I just breeze through the science section. It's amazing. I love it. But the admissions officers are not looking at the SAT or ACT any differently. So it's only from the student's perspective about how much they like that science section. And remember, the science section, it's more like a reading section. So when they want schools that care about your students' science knowledge, they're looking at subject tests. They're not looking at the science section of the ACT. The science section of the ACT is easy science. It's really reading and applying those types of abstract skills to that. So if your student's interested in science, focus their efforts on the science subject tests. Yeah?
Are there practice subject tests that you do in school, or?
There are practice subject tests. I have resources that I can direct students to. They don't have as many tests because the SAT, they're pumping out exams like all the time. They have a really rigorous process where they're constantly producing new exams. For subject tests, they're not moving at that same pace. So the SAT releases fewer tests out into the world. So for subject exams, I really encourage students to buy one of those books put out by one of those major companies that will have some practice tests. But more importantly, we'll walk them through the different sections of those subject exams.
For the subject test, when will be the best time to start preparing?
Hopefully they've been preparing in their classes. That's what we really want. And so at the end of a class, usually students will jump into those subject tests. They're like, oh, I've already been studying for the final. I've gone through this entire class. You know, I'm going to prepare a little bit more and then, boom, take the subject test and really use the knowledge when it's freshest in the student's mind.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Will Chaminade be offering any SAT prep course that they've done in the past, like 6 weeks prior to the test?
Right now, we only have PSAT prep for the students. Right now, there is no SAT class on campus and structured right now. But of course, we have in the past, and so there's no reason why we couldn't structure that for the future. But really, that's something that larger body decides, is this something our community needs? For the most part, we really like to encourage students to use a lot of our free resources and make sure that we have something in place for their own sort of self-study plan. Okay, it is 9 o'clock. I want to be respectful of your time, but all of the counselors are going to be here. I'll be here, and so you can ask us any individual questions you might have, talk about any sort of intricacies of testing, and even if later on down the road you have questions about testing, we're available to you. So thank you so much for your time today.